On the morning of March 4th, 2026, shipping companies around the world received a message that no one in the global economy had ever truly prepared for. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps officially declared the Strait of Hormuz closed. Not threatened, not warned about, closed. And in that single announcement, roughly 13 million barrels of crude oil per day, approximately 1/5 of everything the world burns every single day, stopped moving. The International Energy Agency would later characterize what followed as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Not since the 1973 Arab oil embargo had the world seen anything remotely close to this scale of disruption. But this time, the United States military did not watch from a distance. What happened next was a level of military mobilization that stunned analysts, shattered energy markets, cost tens of billions of dollars, and ultimately revealed something deeply important about the gap between raw military power and genuine strategic outcome. A gap that will be studied by scholars, strategists, and defense planners for the next 50 years. To fully understand what the U.S. military unleashed, you first have to understand exactly what the Strait of Hormuz represents to the global economy and why Iran was uniquely positioned to close it in the first place. The strait sits at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, squeezed between the Iranian coastline to its north and Oman to its south. At its narrowest navigable point, the shipping lane in each direction is approximately 2 miles wide. 2 miles. That is the width of a small urban neighborhood. Yet through those 2 miles flowed roughly 21 million barrels of crude oil and petroleum products every single day in the first half of 2025, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration. That number represents close to 20% of total global oil consumption. Beyond oil, the strait also carries the world's largest volumes of liquefied natural gas, almost entirely exported from Qatar, a country that has no viable alternative export route to reach its massive customer base across Europe, Japan, South Korea, India, and the rest of Asia. Saudi Arabia alone was exporting 29 million barrels per day through the strait in the first quarter of 2025. Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, and Bahrain all depend almost entirely on this single passage to move their energy exports to world markets. When Iran declared it was closing the strait, it was not threatening a regional supply disruption. It was reaching directly into the central nervous system of the global energy economy and squeezing it shut with decades of deliberate preparation behind that action. The geography of the strait makes it uniquely vulnerable to exactly the kind of disruption Iran was planning. The narrow channel, the shallow waters of the Persian Gulf, the presence of Iranian territory and Iranian-controlled islands overlooking the shipping lanes. All of these features had been studied obsessively by Iranian military planners for decades. Iran's entire naval doctrine, developed and refined since the end of the Iran-Iraq War in the late 1980s, was built around a single central concept: denying access to the Strait of Hormuz through asymmetric and low-cost means. Not by building a navy capable of challenging the United States fleet in open ocean engagements, that was always an impossibility given the imbalance of conventional power, but by making the strait itself too dangerous and too expensive for anyone to use without Iran's permission. The roots of this doctrine go back to the tanker war of 1987 and 1988, when Iran first demonstrated that small, fast attack boats, floating mines, and shore-based missiles could impose enormous costs on commercial shipping in the Persian Gulf, with relatively cheap means. That experience became the foundational text of Iranian naval strategy. Every ship Iran commissioned, every missile it deployed along its coastline, every mine it stockpiled, every drone program it funded, all of it was a direct elaboration of the lesson learned in that conflict. And when the war of 2026 began, Iran was better prepared to execute that doctrine than it had ever been in its history. To achieve its strait denial capability, Iran had built shore-based anti-ship missile systems positioned along its coastline and on strategic islands that command the shipping lanes. It stockpiled thousands of naval mines over the course of multiple decades. It developed and deployed swarms of armed fast attack boats crewed by Revolutionary Guard sailors who trained specifically for close quarters harassment of large, slow-moving commercial vessels. It built armed drone programs capable of operating over the strait in large numbers from dispersed and concealed launch sites. It commissioned small submarines specifically designed for the confined, shallow waters of the Persian Gulf. Every element of this capability was engineered not to fight a conventional naval battle, but to make the Strait of Hormuz so dangerous that the economic and political cost of fighting through it would exceed the willingness of any adversary to absorb that cost. On March 4, 2026, Iran activated that entire system. What made this moment different from every previous Iranian threat to close the strait was the specific confluence of military, political, and technological factors that had aligned. Iran had more and better anti-ship missiles than it had ever possessed. Its drone program, developed extensively through its proxy war experience in Yemen and its direct military operations across the region, had matured into a serious anti-access capability that no previous Iranian government could claim. It had years of sanctions-driven incentive to develop domestic alternatives to imported military hardware, and those domestic programs had delivered. The IRGC's naval branch had also learned from every confrontation with American naval power since the 1980s, observing how the U.S. Navy operated, understanding its standard procedures, and developing tactics specifically designed to exploit the gaps between American conventional dominance and the realities of fighting in a narrow, mineable, drone-accessible, missile-flanked waterway. Iran in 2026 was not the Iran of 1987. It was a significantly more capable asymmetric adversary in the specific geography that mattered most. The closure of the strait did not arrive without context. It was Iran's direct military retaliation for something that had happened just 4 days earlier. On February 28, 2026, at approximately 1:15 in the morning Eastern Standard Time, U.S. Central Command and the Israeli Defense Forces launched a massive coordinated preemptive military campaign against Iran. The American operation was codenamed Operation Epic Fury. The Israeli component was codenamed Operation Roaring Lion. Months of high-stakes negotiations over Iran's nuclear enrichment program, its ballistic missile development program, and its extensive support for regional proxy forces, in Lebanon through Hezbollah, in Iraq through Shia militias, in Yemen through the Houthis, and in Syria through Revolutionary Guard deployments, had collapsed without producing a binding agreement. The decision was made at the highest levels in Washington and Jerusalem to move from diplomacy to direct military action. The scale of the opening strikes was extraordinary by any historical measure. In the first 48 hours, the United States carried out over 1,700 sorties and struck more than 1,250 Iranian targets. The target list included Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps command and control infrastructure, Iran's integrated air defense networks, missile and drone launch sites, major military airfields, and nuclear enrichment facilities at Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. And in those opening hours, one strike above all others defined what kind of conflict this would become. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, who had led the Islamic Republic for 34 years, and around whose authority Iran's entire theocratic power structure was organized, was assassinated in the opening night of the campaign. The head of state of a nation of 90 million people killed in the first hours of the war. Iran's response was immediate, total, and geographically expansive. Tehran activated what it called Operation True Promiser 4, extending military retaliation to 7 countries within 48 hours. By day 4 of the war, Iran had launched over 500 ballistic missiles and approximately 2,000 drones, according to Pentagon and CENTCOM reporting. Pre-war Israeli intelligence estimates had placed Iran's total ballistic missile arsenal at approximately 2,500 weapons. Iran was expending its strategic deterrent reserve at a rate that shocked outside observers. And while that aerial exchange was unfolding in the skies, something even more consequential was being set in motion on the water. The strait closure was backed immediately by sustained and lethal force. IRGC gunboats boarded and attacked merchant ships attempting transit. Iran began actively laying naval mines in the shipping lanes. An extraordinarily insidious weapon because mines do not stop functioning when a ceasefire is declared. They cannot be recalled by diplomatic pressure, and they are extraordinarily dangerous and time-consuming to locate and remove. Iran deployed armed drones to threaten tanker crews. Anti-ship missiles were fired at vessels using unauthorized routes. The Cyprus-flagged container ship GFS Galaxy was struck and sustained significant damage to its engine room, with one crew member going missing. 2 Indian-flagged merchant ships came under direct fire, prompting India's foreign ministry to summon Iran's ambassador in New Delhi. At least 17 merchant ships were damaged in total during the crisis. 7 were abandoned mid-voyage by their crews. 2 were physically captured by Iranian forces. 12 seafarers were killed or went missing. A port worker in Bahrain was killed. A tugboat was sunk. The human cost accumulated alongside the economic one in real time across one of the world's busiest commercial shipping corridors. The liquefied natural gas dimension of the crisis deserves its own attention because it is often overshadowed by the more dramatic oil price headlines, but it was equally consequential for different regions of the global economy. Qatar alone exports approximately 77 million tons of liquefied natural gas per year, representing roughly a fifth of global LNG supply. Almost all of it moves through the Strait of Hormuz. European countries that had already undergone one traumatic energy transition away from Russian pipeline gas after 2022 now found their replacement supply disrupted as well. Asian LNG buyers, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, faced an energy emergency that threatened industrial production and household energy security simultaneously. Spot LNG prices in Asia spiked to levels not seen since the energy crisis of 2021 and 2022. The compounding effect of simultaneously disrupting oil and LNG supplies from the same geographic choke point was something global energy markets had never experienced before and had never been required to plan for at scale. The seafarer community, The largely invisible workforce of perhaps 2 million people globally who physically move the cargo that sustains modern civilization was at the sharp end of this conflict in ways that rarely received the attention they deserved from those watching at a safe distance. Crews who had spent weeks or months at sea suddenly found themselves on vessels anchored in the Gulf of Oman with no safe port to make for, no insurer willing to cover their ship's passage, and no government willing to guarantee their safe return. The International Maritime Organization issued emergency guidance. The International Transport Workers Federation demanded that crews be prioritized in any ceasefire negotiations. Unions across Europe and Asia warned that the ongoing crisis was producing a generational crisis of confidence in maritime careers at precisely the moment the global shipping industry was already struggling with severe crew shortages. The human geography of the Strait of Hormuz closure was as consequential in its own way as the economic one, even if it attracted far less coverage. The economic consequences of the closure moved at a speed that left even the most experienced commodity traders struggling to process what they were witnessing. Shipping companies began suspending all strait operations almost immediately. Insurance for any vessel attempting transit became either completely unavailable or so prohibitively expensive as to be functionally impossible for commercial operators. Before the crisis, war risk insurance for a strait transit was priced at approximately zero, or 125% of a vessel's whole value per trip. At the peak of the crisis in March 2026, that figure reached between 2, 5, and 5% of whole value, a 40-fold increase in a matter of days. For a very large crude carrier, that premium translated to approximately $5 million per transit in insurance alone, before accounting for fuel, crew wages, port fees, or the cost of the cargo itself. No commercial shipping operator could absorb that cost and remain financially viable. Oil markets reacted with historic severity. Brent crude surged 3% on the very first day of the conflict, the largest single-day gain in the crude oil market since March 2022. By the end of March 2026, the Brent price had increased by approximately 65% from its pre-conflict level, recording the highest monthly price increase ever measured in the history of the modern oil market, according to the World Bank's April 2026 Commodity Markets Outlook. Futures markets settled around $97 per barrel for Brent in early April. But the physical oil market, the actual price that Asian refineries and European buyers were paying for delivered crude, stood at $132 per barrel. That gap of approximately $35 between the futures price and the physical delivery price had no direct historical precedent as a single crisis phenomenon. The Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas calculated that a strait closure removing close to 20% of global oil supplies from the market during the second quarter of 2026 was expected to raise the average West Texas intermediate crude price to $98 per barrel and reduce global real GDP growth by an annualized 9 percentage points in that quarter. Middle Eastern oil producers collectively cut output by over 11 million barrels per day as the conflict disrupted the region. This triggered global oil inventory draws averaging 3 million barrels per day in the second quarter of 2026 and a projected 6 million barrels per day draw in the third quarter. OECD oil inventories fell to their lowest level since 2003. The cumulative supply loss exceeded 360 million barrels in March alone. Solubility characterized the 2026 Hormuz closure as the largest supply disruption since the 1973 Arab oil embargo and highlighted a key difference. Unlike 1973, this crisis simultaneously disrupted oil, liquefied natural gas, fertilizers, and refined petroleum products all at once, compounding the economic impact far beyond any single commodity shock the world had previously experienced. For countries structurally dependent on Persian Gulf energy, the disruption was immediately and acutely painful. Japan and South Korea faced the prospect of refinery shutdowns within weeks if the closure persisted. India found its flagged vessels being fired upon while simultaneously grappling with its own supply crisis at home. China, importing approximately 76 million barrels per day through the Strait and deeply economically intertwined with Iranian oil exports under its comprehensive strategic partnership with Tehran, faced both the supply disruption and the enormous diplomatic complexity of having Chinese vessels subject to an American naval blockade. The Chinese government issued formal protests through diplomatic channels, even as its tanker operators quietly rerouted what vessels they could. Qatar's liquefied natural gas exports, which had been partially filling the gap in European energy markets after Russia's 2022 gas cutoff, now faced their own crisis. Shipping companies that attempted to reroute tankers around the Cape of Good Hope found that this alternative route, adding approximately 2 weeks to each transit, could only absorb a fraction of the volume normally flowing through Hormuz. The global logistics system had been built over decades around the assumption that the Strait of Hormuz would remain open. That assumption had just been proved wrong. The Islamabad ceasefire talks, which collapsed on April 13th and triggered the naval blockade, deserve particular attention because their failure illuminates exactly why the conflict proved so resistant to resolution, even when military pressure from both sides was at its most intense. The talks involved American, Iranian, Pakistani, and Omani representatives. Pakistan played a broker role given its relationships with both Washington and Tehran. The core issue was not tactical. Both sides expressed willingness in principle to reduce military activity. The core issue was verification and sequencing. Iran demanded an end to American airstrikes before reopening the strait. The United States demanded the strait reopen before ending airstrikes. Neither side trusted the other to follow through on a simultaneous stand-down, and neither was wrong to be skeptical given the history of the conflict. The talks collapsed not because diplomats failed to find language for an agreement, but because neither government trusted the other enough to go first. The naval blockade followed within hours of the talks ending. And this is precisely the moment when the United States military began to respond with everything at its disposal. The first phase of the American military response was built into Operation Epic Fury itself from the beginning, specifically aimed at dismantling Iran's naval power before it could be brought to bear in the strait. The stated American objective was to neutralize Iran's capacity to project naval force, destroying major surface combatants and shore-based enabling systems before they could enter the fight. On March 4th, the Iranian frigate Irandina was struck by a torpedo launched from a U.S. Navy submarine and sank in waters off Sri Lanka. 32 of its 180 sailors were rescued. 101 remain missing. Iranian major surface combatants were struck at their piers in the initial hours of Operation Epic Fury before they could be sortied. Once in the confined waters of the Persian Gulf, the tactical calculus of engagement would have been far more complex. American planners solved that problem by preventing them from ever leaving port. But destroying surface ships was not sufficient to reopen the strait. The mines were already in the water. The shore-based anti-ship cruise missiles occupied hardened, reinforced concrete positions and tunnels cut into the Iranian coastline and islands. The drone programs were dispersed across hundreds of concealed sites spanning the Iranian coastline. These asymmetric capabilities were designed from the ground up to be dispersed, redundant, and survivable under sustained air attack. This is the defining strategic challenge of fighting an adversary that has spent decades engineering its defenses around the specific vulnerabilities of a superior conventional military. The attacker brings overwhelming firepower, but the defender has chosen a weapon system and deployment methodology specifically designed to absorb that firepower and keep functioning below the threshold of complete suppression. The dedicated American aerial campaign against the Strait of Hormuz began March 19, 2026, executed by U.S. Air Force units, Navy aviation from the carrier strike groups, and Israeli Air Force elements. American aircraft dropped 5,000-pound bunker-buster bombs against hardened anti-ship cruise missile sites on the Iranian coastline and on the strategic islands overlooking the shipping lanes. U.S. forces sank 16 Iranian mine-laying vessels that were actively seeding additional mines into the waterway in a direct effort to cut off resupply before the strait became permanently impassable. Navy destroyers, USS Frankie Peterson Jr. and USS Michael Murphy, conducted a deliberate transit of the strait as part of a mine clearance and reconnaissance mission. Their passage was assessed as a deliberate test of Iranian coastal defense capabilities and a demonstration that a specific corridor was believed navigable. They transited. They were not struck. That survival was itself operationally significant information about the state of Iranian defenses. The naval blockade of Iran, announced April 13, 2026, following the collapse of the Islamabad ceasefire talks, was an escalation to a category of action the United States had not taken against any nation of Iran's size in the modern era. The blockade covered the entirety of Iran's coastline, all ports and all coastal areas on both the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. Any vessel entering or departing blockaded Iranian waters without authorization was subject to interdiction, regardless of flag or nationality. CENTCOM was explicit. The blockade would be enforced impartially against vessels of all nations. The geopolitical implications were profound. Enforcing a blockade against Chinese tankers and Russian cargo ships heading to Iranian ports was a fundamentally different kind of great power confrontation than anything the United States had attempted in the post-Cold War era. It placed the U.S. in direct enforcement conflict with 2 permanent members of the UN Security Council, adding a superpower dimension to what had begun as a regional war. The force assembled to enforce that blockade was the largest single-theater American naval concentration in decades. At its core, USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group, equipped with F-35C fifth-generation stealth fighters, the most capable carrier-based aircraft ever deployed in the CENTCOM region, and USS George H.W. Bush Carrier Strike Group, operating with 25 FA-18EF Super Hornets, 2 E-2D Advanced Hawkeye airborne early warning aircraft, and 3 MH-60 Seahawk helicopters visible on its flight deck during operations. A third carrier strike group was subsequently ordered to the region. 14 guided missile destroyers and additional surface combatants brought the total American surface naval presence to over 20 warships operating in the Arabian Sea and Indian Ocean simultaneously. The amphibious component added USS Boxer, USS Comstock, and USS Portland, carrying the 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit with approximately 5,000 Marines and sailors, joining the Tripoli Amphibious Ready Group that had been on station since March. The combined maritime and expeditionary combat power was an unmistakable demonstration of commitment at a scale that went well beyond any limited punitive operation. Blockade enforcement was systematic and sustained. CENTCOM forces redirected more than 140 compliant commercial vessels during the first blockade period alone, hailing captains and ordering course changes away from Iranian ports. 9 vessels that refused to comply were kinetically disabled. In at least one documented case, AGM-114 Hellfire missiles were fired into the smokestack of an unladen oil tanker heading toward Karg Island, disabling it without sinking it. A total of 85 vessels were intercepted across the combined blockade periods. 3 ships were seized. The blockade was estimated by U.S. officials to be costing Iran approximately $500 million per day in lost revenue. For a government surviving under years of sanctions and now under sustained military attack, losing $500 million per day was an existential economic pressure that no political leadership could ignore indefinitely. Israel added its own decisive action to the broader campaign. On March 26, 2026, Israeli forces conducted an airstrike on Bandar Abbas and killed Alireza Tangsiri, who had commanded the IRGC Navy since August 2018 and had been identified as the principal architect of the Hormuz blockade strategy. Tangsiri had spent years developing the specific operational doctrine, the layered combination of mines, drones, fast attack boats, and coastal missiles that Iran was now executing with devastating economic effect. Iran confirmed his death on March 30th. The man who had designed and built Iran's most powerful strategic weapon was eliminated from the battlefield within the first month of the conflict. Iranian forces continued to operate under alternative command chains, but the decapitation of the strategy's principal author was operationally and psychologically significant. Operation Project Freedom, launched May 4, 2026, was the most direct American attempt to physically restore straight transit for commercial shipping. U.S. forces provided naval escort to merchant vessels willing to make the passage. 7 Iranian gunboats were sunk during the operation when they approached or engaged escorted convoys. A French CMA-CGM container ship was struck and damaged despite the protective escort. The operation was paused the following day as Trump announced great progress toward a possible agreement. The pause was revealing. Military force had been brought to the threshold of physically restoring passage, but the final step, durable, commercial, large-scale reopening, required a political resolution that military action in an asymmetric environment could not deliver independently. The ceasefire signed June 19, 2026, in Switzerland was a 14-point memorandum of understanding under which the strait would reopen and fighting would halt for 60 days. Iran briefly reopened the strait, allowing limited traffic, but the agreement collapsed in early July. Both sides resumed strikes. The blockade was reinstated July 14, 2026, with CENTCOM issuing a formal operational statement confirming enforcement would resume at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. By July 20th, U.S. forces were conducting a 9th consecutive night of precision airstrikes. The ceasefire had been described by defense analyst Max Boot, writing for the Council on Foreign Relations, as widely criticized as an act of appeasement on Trump's part after failing to reopen the waterway by military force or achieve other stated military objectives. As of late July 2026, the conflict continued in a sustained phase of managed escalation with no clear pathway to definitive resolution. The total direct military cost, as estimated by CSIS, was between $34 and $42 billion through the ceasefire period. The Pentagon disclosed more than 20 American service members killed in action and approximately 700 wounded. The broader economic cost, measured in lost global GDP, disrupted supply chains, elevated energy prices, inflation, and long-term market restructuring, was orders of magnitude larger. The Dallas Fed model projected that even if the strait reopened after a single quarter, global real GDP would remain 0, 2% below its pre-closure level by year-end 2026, and 0, 1% below by year-end 2027. The mines remained the most intractable problem of the entire conflict. At one point, Iran announced it had lost track of the exact locations of some of its own mines in the strait, a statement Trump himself referenced publicly. Naval mines do not respond to ceasefires. They do not leave when the politics change. Mine clearance is measured in months, not days. The U.S. Navy's dedicated mine countermeasures assets, helicopters equipped with mine-hunting sonar, underwater remotely operated vehicles, and dedicated mine countermeasures ships were all deployed to the theater. But clearing mines from a heavily contested, tactically active waterway against an adversary still capable of laying new ones is not a problem that any amount of air power or blockade pressure can directly solve. The waterway that carries 1/5 of the world's oil had, in the spring of 2026, an unknown number of mines at unknown positions on its seafloor. That fact alone, independent of any political development, any military strike, any diplomatic agreement, made the Strait of Hormuz a more dangerous and more economically costly place to navigate than at any point in the history of modern commercial shipping. The analytical consensus across CSIS, the Institute for the Study of War, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Sufan Center, and Brookings was consistent and sobering. The United States achieved significant tactical damage to Iran's visible military infrastructure. Major surface naval units were destroyed before deployment. IRGC leadership was extensively targeted and degraded. Missile and drone launch infrastructure was severely damaged across multiple target categories, but the underground facilities survived. Fordo, buried under a mountain specifically to withstand exactly this kind of air campaign, continued to function. Iran's asymmetric naval capabilities, the dispersed mines, the small fast attack boats, the coastal drone programs, the tunnel-protected anti-ship missiles, were too numerous, too geographically distributed, and too specifically engineered for survivability to be comprehensively neutralized from the air at any operationally achievable scale of strike effort. And the political outcome the United States sought, a new comprehensive agreement on Iran's nuclear program, ballistic missiles, and regional proxies, was not achieved through the application of military force at any scale that was actually deployed. The formation of the Persian Gulf Strait Authority, a new international body established during the ceasefire period to coordinate vessel transit, mine clearance operations, and security monitoring in the strait, represented an attempt to institutionalize what the conflict had exposed about the inadequacy of existing frameworks for managing access to global maritime chokepoints. Whether that body would survive the collapse of the ceasefire and the re-escalation of the conflict was, as of August 2026, genuinely uncertain. It stood as a bureaucratic symbol of the broader truth the conflict had demonstrated, that the Strait of Hormuz is too important to be left to the management of a single nation's goodwill and too dangerous to be secured by any single nation's military power, no matter how overwhelming that power appears in the abstract. Iran's strategy was never to defeat the United States military in any conventional sense. It was to impose costs on commercial shipping, on global energy markets, on American political patience, the credibility of U.S. security guarantees to its Gulf allies, and on the long-term confidence of any government anywhere in the world in the ability of the United States to guarantee freedom of navigation in the waterway that matters most to the global economy. By those measures, Iran achieved something real and significant. Shipping insurance premiums reached 40 times pre-crisis levels. The global oil market experienced its worst supply shock since 1973. OECD oil inventories fell to their lowest point in over 2 decades. 7 countries in the region came under Iranian missile attack within the first 48 hours of the war. Multiple American service members were killed and hundreds wounded in what became a sustained campaign without a decisive conclusion. A ceasefire that was supposed to end the conflict collapsed within weeks of its signing. The world had been warned about this scenario for 50 years. Energy security analysts, naval strategists, geopolitical researchers, and intelligence assessors had written thousands of pages about the vulnerability of the Strait of Hormuz and the catastrophic consequences of its closure. The warnings were detailed, they were specific, and they were correct in their assessment of consequences. What the events of 2026 added to everything that had already been written was the one piece of information that no amount of prior theoretical analysis could substitute for: direct empirical evidence of what happens when that closure actually occurs, when the military response actually deploys at full scale, and when the gap between American military power and American strategic achievement is measured not in theoretical models, but in barrels of oil per day, dollars of economic damage, American service members killed and wounded, and the number of months it takes for the world's most powerful armed forces to reopen 2 miles of contested water. The United States military unleashed everything available to it. 3 carrier strike groups, over 20 warships, bunker buster bombs, submarine torpedoes, a comprehensive naval blockade of an entire nation's coastline, escort convoys in a live combat zone, mine clearance missions in contested waters, the targeted assassination of Iran's top naval commander, 16 mine layers sunk, $40 billion and counting. And the Strait of Hormuz taught the world something it had been told about for half a century, but had never truly absorbed until the spring of 2026. Some problems do not have a military solution. They only have a military cost.